So I'm really honored to be here, and I'm especially honored to be contributing to the honors for Rachel Carson. As you might know, she's grew up around Pittsburgh and in a farm near Springdale. There's now a wonderful Rachel Carson Trail. There's a Rachel Carson Challenge to see whether you can do the 37 miles between sundown and sunset on the weekend closest to the solstice. So time to get in shape. Another Springdale has also until very recently been the home of a very large coal-fired power plant, which just came down. So I think this is a picture that will wake everybody up. Our daughter Maya, who many of you know from her time at ESPP at Michigan State, suggested I add some local color, specifically mentioning her favorite restaurant. So I don't really know East Lansing area that well, so I thought I would give some local color from Detroit, where I grew up. So I went to James Verner Elementary School, named after the ginger ale magnate, Samuel C. Mumford High School with its signature maroon and blue colors, Wayne State University, where I wasn't part of the band, but I like this picture, and I worked my way through college at Great Lakes Lanes at the counter. Not we had automatic pin setters, and in rummaging through old stuff, I also found this relic of the Cold War. These are kind of dog tags that the Civil Defense Authority wanted us to have, and I guess I thought that you couldn't be picky about the RH factor. It was good enough to know your major blood type. So the puzzle I'd like to address in today's talk is one that's been with me most of my career, which is how do we make ourselves useful and, where possible, advance our science in the process. So I'd like to talk about three things. One is what I call climate change and me. Second is three roles for the behavioral sciences in this kind of integration. And then finally, some thoughts on how we organize ourselves for sustainability science. So climate change and me. So my introduction very early in my career was through Bob Cates, who was a legendary geographer. If you've never heard of him, I recommend reading his biography. He was a great scientist, a great idealist, a great activist, and Bob thought that I would somehow be able to contribute to what was to be a 20-year planning process led by the Department of Energy, which was then new at that time. This was 1979, 1980, and supported and led by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. This was our leadership group, climate scientist, Sylvan Whitworth, the agronomist from Michigan State, Steve Schneider, who many of you might know. This was our organization. We had one group on environmental effects on the ocean's cryosphere and ocean biota, two groups on the biosphere, one for the less managed and one for the managed biosphere. So even before Bill McKibben, there were people who realized that there might be we're thinking in terms of the end of nature, that there was nothing that didn't have, I guess, in the Anthropocene, didn't have what wasn't affected by our activities, a panel on social and institutional responses, and one on economic and geopolitical. I was in the social and institutional responses. We were led by Elise Boulding, who's a fabled sociologist, particularly looking at women, and Steve Schneider. It was a very interdisciplinary group. Remarkably, two of us, myself and Bob Chen, who was our grad student at our rapporteur, both of us had sons who were on the third U.S. National Climate Assessment about 30 years later. This is a statement from our report. I won't read it all. The slides will be available if anybody is interested later on, and most of them have links to the sources. But if you look at it, it was more or less true today. The CO2 issue appears to be a gradually developing problem, and is so far proceeding too slowly to attract significant public notice. And maybe we finally turned the corner on that 40 years later. It does have aspects that are linked to other high priority social problems and so on. the people who led this group, which I was played some small role, understood what we were up against in 1979. And it calls for unprecedented interdisciplinary research effort. We met at this hotel. It was in the Annapolis Hilton. Somebody else has the franchise now. We had representatives of the Global Atmospheric Research Program, which is at that time the international coordinating body. Around the corner, there was a bookstore that was filled with this book, which one might hope was The World According to the Global Atmospheric Research Program, but was actually about, well, no, maybe somewhat related. So you would think we're ready to go from our lips. I had an opportunity to write what might be the first paper on this topic. And then the whole thing died. One of the first things that the Reagan administration did in early 1981 was to pull the plug on the AAAS DOE effort. So these were the topics in my paper, which was what's worth knowing. What are the properties of the information? How well can we convey that evidence? What's our place in the political process? What is our place in the politics of science? And it turned out that the last two turned out to be pivotal for the behavioral sciences and social science. So as I mentioned, the Reagan administration pulled the plug on this. The natural sciences, most of which had programs, were able to soldier on and then build back up, doing their important work when the funding started to increase. But there really were no behavioral science programs, so there was no lobby for them, no place to put the resources. Thinking that things would get better, we put together a volume. Bob, Elise, and Steve edited. I recruited my colleague Lita Furby to help me write this write this chapter. And over the next 20 years, maybe a quarter of a century, there was very little behavioral science research. One exception was Willett Kempton's wonderful multi-method interdisciplinary book on environmental values in American culture. We had funding from NSF that enabled us to do some of our first projects on mental models, interviewing, which is trying to get at how people think about problems as well as what they think the problems are. We had these two papers in risk analysis early in the 1990s. John Krosnick had managed to cobble together the closest thing we had to a time series of people's thinking about climate change in the 1990s and early 2000s. In the late 1980s, the National Academy of Sciences assembled a committee on the human dimensions of global change. It was a fantastic committee. Among other things, it was the place where I first got to know your Tom Dietz. Some of you will know some of these names. We put together a book with a lovely color, and still more or less nothing happened. The book came out in 1992. And Eric Barron, who was a climate scientist who some of you may know, who recently retired as president of Penn State and had been a member of the committee, said if we wanted to be part of the solution, we needed to do big science and to integrate ourselves with the big natural science research program, which is often not what behavioral scientists do. We're kind of boutique affairs. We learn a little bit about people, learn a little bit about problems, and then try to do work that's theory driven, and that will somehow illuminate those problems. So things began to move in the 2000s, thanks to Gus Speth, again, some of you may know, put together a fantastic interdisciplinary, intersectoral working group that produced this book in 2005. And then suddenly in the late 2000s, there was just a surge of research and some funding. So now there's a vast amount of research on public perceptions of risk and research on behavioral change. Some of it picking up threads from research done in the late 1970s in response to the oil crisis. So what could we do in the spirit of our work and what Eric suggested to us? So one can think of three roles for the behavioral sciences. One is to communicate environmental science to decision makers, take better use of the fantastic work that's being done. Second is to treat environmental science as a behavior. Well, we're people, all of us scientists. How does the behavior of the scientists affect the work that they do and their interpretation of it? And then finally, to do behavioral research that informs environmental decisions, driven more by the decision than by our own endogenous research program. So communicating environmental science to decision makers. So it's useful to think of two kinds of science, of communication. One, there's communication that's focused on the science. So we have formal science education in our schools, gives us the foundations for understanding things. We have informal science education in science museums, 4-H, and other places, which elaborate on specific topics at some depth. And then we have science reporting, which tells about the latest results, somehow integrated with the two, but they're really about the science, telling its stories. And then what has come to be called risk communication, which is communication about risks and benefits and other inputs to decisions that people face. So it's an attempt to distinguish things that would be nice to know to things that people need to know in a particular situation. So that's the kind of research that my colleagues and students and I mostly do. So how do we approach this risk communication, which again is about risks and benefits and it's all the things that you might need to know. We analyze decisions to find out to look hard at what people face, do descriptive research looking at how people currently deal with them, and then try to do interventions that help people to make better decisions. Colleagues and we've worked this general problem from a wide variety of perspective. One of my current graduate students, Ben Therian, is looking about how growers think about nanotechnology in agriculture. So wide variety of topics. How can we cover the field? Well, there's for the analytical part of these research projects, there's a relatively small set of analytical tools that one needs to know. Once we know them, one has standard ways to characterize a wide variety of decisions using the method that's most appropriate. Second, there's a small set of empirical research methods that one learns as part of one's apprenticeship in the behavioral sciences. Third, there's a vast amount of behavioral science research that might be relevant to a particular problem, which might or might not be your research, but is something that, as a representative of the field, you have ability to draw on. So as an example of these behavioral principles, there's some that deal with judgment, which is the jargon for how people think about the world. There are many people who've studied for many years how people learn about the frequency of things that happen in their world. This would be a stylized summary from that field that people are good at tracking what they see, make an argument for evolutionary value for that, but they're not so good at detecting bias in the samples that they see. They might not even think about that, and if they do, it's hard to correct from what you see to what you haven't seen. This is considered to be an automatic process by people who work on it. There's disputes about exactly how it works. There are general principles of choice. So people consider the return on their investment in making decisions. So in an application in this area, if people think that you know them and are trying to help them and speak their language and are getting to the point, they're more likely to invest in your communications. And there's also research that is dedicated to things that are perhaps not part of everyday decision making, but are very important in thinking. It can be very important in thinking about science-related decisions, like, well, how do you communicate numerical estimates? How do you communicate exponential processes like the growth of invasive species? How do you communicate scientific uncertainty or the kind of quality control that science has? Here's an example of the kinds of studies that come out of this, applying these methodologies here. Part of her dissertation, Rachel Dryden and her advisors looked at how people, or if people, distinguish between air pollution and carbon dioxide in terms of how long they reside in the atmosphere, and found that the mental models that work pretty well in air pollution don't work all that well for carbon dioxide, suggesting that that a part of the challenge of communications about climate change is to give people the right mental models. A formulation that I attribute to our late colleague Herb Simon: behavior follows simple principles. This is, if you're familiar with the earlier generation of AI, this was part of the approach that Herb and Alan Newell and other approaches, However, However, the set of principles is large. You just saw a subset there. The contextual triggers are subtle. Their interactions are complex. As a result, any communication, like any scientific theory, needs testing, because you just don't know how it's going to work out, even if you know everything that's out there. So that kind of testing is easy. Just ask a few people to read a draft aloud of a communication that you're putting together, saying whatever comes to their mind about what is there, what is missing, and then how the communication sounds to them. Unfortunately, this turns out to be an unnatural act, that people have faulty intuitions about how well they understand other people and how well other people understand them. As a result, they think they're doing a better job than they actually are. They communicate poorly and then blame their audience because their message seems to have been perfectly clear. So here's an example of I think a good collaboration. So many of you may be familiar with Climate Central, which is a fantastic job of tailoring climate-related information to actual users. This is a screenshot from their website in about 10 years ago. At that time, they were making public the Surging Seas website, and Ben Strauss, who was I guess is now the CEO there, was responsible for this project. And he realized that their attempt to give people every possible option in thinking about the effects of sea level rise led to a landing page that was incredibly cluttered. If you can see all the options here. One of the options might be, well, what's the water level at which you're concerned? So you could adjust that, its top and center. In order to squeeze in that option, they had to turn the ocean on its side. So you raise the sea level by that interests you by moving to the right. So Ben had gone to graduate school, ecology and evolutionary biology with our son Ilya. So he knew me and he asked if I could help. I recruited Gabrielle Wong-Perotti, who's now at Stanford, and she and Ben did a redesign that led to this as a simplified landing page where people could easily orient themselves, get a feeling for a couple of the options, but then drill down to find the things that they really wanted. Not particularly interesting theoretically, but a practical collaboration. But in order to keep the basic science going, you would like to have basic research spin off. So Gabrielle, with some support from me, did a project where she asked people to find a house that they would love to live in for the rest of their life in Savannah, Georgia, using Zillow with their permission, showed them a typical non-interactive map of where a house was located in the I guess estuary, and then gave them the chance to study surging seas, and then to ask see whether they could use that information in their decision making. So she had measures of usability. She also did an experiment. I'm just showing you the diagram of an experiment without asking you to go into it, in which she varied two things. So it's important to find out what people thought about climate change, but you could either ask people at the beginning, or you could ask people at the end. You might say, well, if you ask people at the beginning, you're priming them, and that's going to lead to greater differences between climate believers and skeptics. But it turns out that it reduced, by asking people about their position on climate change, seemed to reduce the effect of that prior position on their responses. We think that's because we showed people that we recognized that there were differences, and having said that they could work the problem and didn't need to express themselves in the task. So, but it's basically conflicting hypotheses, and you really need to collect the evidence to find out what happens. Ralph Cicerone, the late great climate scientist, in around 2009, 2010, realized that that somehow the climate story wasn't telling itself, and prompted three National Academy colloquia on the science of science communication that I had the opportunity to help to organize, where we brought in people from sciences both scientists and practitioners, including scientists, who didn't think of themselves as being in this business, but once you asked them, they had valuable things to say. Second role that we might play is to treat environmental science as behavior. So my colleague Granger Morgan has been a leader in what's called expert elicitation, which is using the cognitive decision science as a way to get experts to summarize evidence about things where we don't have reliable observational data and we can't afford to wait. So here's a paper from 30 years ago that he did with David Keith, who you may know who was at CMU at that time. You may know as a leading person engaged in geoengineering, where they spent a day each with 16 climate experts, asked them to summarize their uncertainty about a variety of different things. This is a plot about what the temperature response would be to a doubling of atmospheric CO2 from, I think, was from 350, I think was the base they used. They used decision-making techniques to try to avoid bias, and includes asking people the same question in different ways, asking them to think about their theories so that they can triangulate on different perspectives. And the bars here basically show how uncertain they are. I was at one of the activities that Gus Speth organized, and happened to talk to Bill Blakemore, who had been head of science for ABC News. And Bill said, this figure is a little esoteric, but this clarified for me what was going on with science, that there were, the individual scientists have a lot of uncertainty, and they share that uncertainty as part of their responsibility, but they all pretty much agree on what's most likely to happen, and that there are also a few skeptics who are outliers from the pack, and who Granger and David particularly sought. And important to see that they're outliers, and interesting that one of the outliers, number 5, had no uncertainty at all. So this is a way of thinking about of translating the uncertainty of the scientists into terms that are useful to decision makers. Here's another figure you might take a look at about an expert elicitation about the Gulf Stream collapsing, in which the scientists here basically fell into two different camps. If you only heard about one from one of those camps, you might have a very different picture of the world. A place where I think we haven't quite joined the discussion is with the people who are trying to incorporate social change through these shared socioeconomic pathways, which are stylized ways in which the world might develop and in which climate might respond and affect the ability to follow those pathways. So here's a place I think we have some joint work to do. As a way of thinking about the psychology of the scientist, my friend from Eugene, Mary O'Brien, who's a botanist, argued that we spend way too much time on analysis, that we ought to be putting the intellectual effort into devising alternatives. And so she makes this MIT Press book, makes a critique that science itself might be misdirected given as a reflection of the psychology and the incentives of the scientific world. I have this paper if anybody's interested. It's more talking about particularly things that tend to get left out of analysis, which typically includes human behavior. Third thing is, well, how do we do research that will be recognizing the need for communication and the limits to where science moves of its own accord? How do we do research that's designed to inform environmental decisions? So, Gabriel, who I mentioned before, Tamar, Alex, and Daniel, who are former graduate students, and I had a set of projects about 10 years ago that we were able to summarize in Nature Climate Change, which was, I believe, the first of the Nature first of the nature journals to include human behavior. And to summarize this research as a way of showing the approach, we said, well, this is what we do. On the left-hand column, we do analysis, so we understand the science in decision makers' terms. Descriptive analysis, we figure out where people are coming from, and then intervention to see whether we can better inform decisions. So the first column is include more of those studies that we did with Climate Central on sea level rise. And the one on the right is a project trying to understand why owners of commercial B and C buildings don't adopt programs that for energy conservation, even though they appear by the designers to be economically attractive. And then we did a set of projects on whether smart grids with in-home displays and the like could be used to improve energy use. So this adopting residential smart grid technologies. We were funded by the America Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which made a lot of money available to in climate and energy related areas. Miraculously, one of the RFPs required behavioral science. Lester Lave, the environmental economist, was friends with people at PepCo, and they said, we can help you to get the project because we're accustomed to collaborating in this space. We wrote a joint proposal and did research, some of which is summarized there. So first thing that Alex and Tamar, supported by Wendy and me, did was to look, what would you do? You look at the studies that are already out there. There are about 30-odd studies looking at attempts to use in-home displays and the like to improve energy consumption. They realized quickly that the quality of those studies wasn't uniformly great. From other work that we were doing, we knew about the Cochrane collaboration, which is the go-to place for medical-related public health meta-analyses. The Cochrane collaboration has standards for evaluating studies before including them in their meta-analyses, which try to extract the overall average of effectiveness of studies. So Alex and Tamar particularly looked at the 32 studies that were available at the time and evaluated them applying the Cochrane standards, which came from medical research, to this other domain in terms of the risk of bias. So they found that most of the studies, 27 of the 32, had high risk of bias because they had volunteers. And if you you imagine people who volunteer for studies are not like everybody else. It might lead to a misestimate of how effective intervention would be. A lot of them, the yellow, or that nobody knew because they didn't bother to tell you. They didn't bother to tell you, or it wasn't a convention in this industry as airfield at the time, what they had done on particular areas. So it turns out that the Cochrane collaboration has a way of correcting studies for their bias. So there are enough studies in which you testing two medical treatments, one with volunteers and one without volunteers, that they have some idea how big how much larger effects are. So they looked at several different interventions in terms of their energy conservation effect. They looked at what was the result that the effect size that reported. So the upper left-hand corner was a 3.76% average reduction in energy consumption. They adjusted it, that's the next column, in terms of what the likely bias would be. And what they found, there are two different sets here using different statistical techniques. What they found is with energy conservation, the reported effects basically all disappeared if you made these adjustments. They also looked, there's some of the studies were directed at peak shaving, which is to reduce use at peak times. Applying the same methodology there showed that about half the effects, but some of them were still statistically significant. So this is a integration of different fields in science to the service of energy conservation. Because they realized that volunteer bias was a big deal, Alex and Tamar did a study trying to figure out how volunteers for energy conservation or peak shaving programs might be different from other people. It was our sense that a lot of the interfaces that were made available for people to use their smart meters weren't very well. So they, along with Casey and Jack Wang, came up with a better design. And then finally, looking at all of these things, we realized that that what happens in experiments isn't always what happens in real life. Many of you will be familiar with the Hawthorne effect. It was perhaps the first study, one of the very first studies in an industrial organization conducted at Western Electric's Hawthorne Works, which tried to change things like the illumination on the productivity of workers making electrical relays. The takeaway at the time from the Hawthorne study was that that just being in a study changed people's behavior. It didn't matter what you did. Somehow you shook things, you changed things, people changed their behavior. It could be that they felt they were being surveilled. It could be that you shook up made boring work more interesting. It could be that people thought that you were paying attention to them. There's a long history of reanalyses of the Hawthorne effect. It seems pretty clear now that there was no Hawthorne effect at Hawthorne. Also turns out from Daniel's reading of the original book that the people who conducted the study knew that that was the case. It was 100 years ago and just didn't know how to do field experiments. Also turns out being very hard to do a Hawthorne study in a way that you're just telling people that they're in a study. So as part of his dissertation, Daniel Schwartz, who's now at the University of at Chile, back home, did this simple study. For 5 weeks, he sent people a postcard, so a random sample of Pepco consumers saying that you have been selected to be part of a 1-month study of how much electricity you use in your home. So not telling them what to do, but in an area where people know what to do if you give them a very gentle reminder and they care about energy conservation. One of the things that we know is that you can analyze data like this in many different ways, and you might get different stories depending on how you analyze the data. So Daniel and Falas Sowell, the econometrician who worked on the study, in interest of full disclosure, did what we would now call pre-registration of the different ways they were going to analyze the data. and presented all of the different analyses. So people could choose the one that was most relevant. Turns out it didn't matter. Turns out however you analyze these data, that these a month of postcards led to about a 2.5% reduction in energy consumption. So imagine that there's something in here that we would like to bring together people who know the technology, people who know the company, who run the companies, who know the natural science and engineering, who have both the basic behavioral science and the decision science oriented application methodologies. Well, what would we want? How would we want to organize ourselves? So one could think of four things: staffing, internal coordination, external coordination, and commitment. So the staffing, there's a term that Eric Ashby, one of the founders of cybernetics, described as requisite variety, where he argued that your solutions need to be as have the sensitivity to be as complex as the problem that you're trying to solve in terms of their major dimensions. So one way of thinking about this is to say, well, if I was going to predict energy consumption or climate change or the siting of homes in coastal areas, what are the things that I would do drawing on the science of those areas in order to predict them? These are influence diagrams for those they're like Bayesian belief networks for those who are familiar with kind of alternative representation there. And you can say, all right, I'm going to try to predict that. I probably can't run the numbers here because I don't have numbers for many of these things, but this at least tells me, if drawing an influence diagram with the factors that predict the outcomes that interest me, gives me an opportunity to know who should be on my team. So these are work that we did with my friend Larry Brilliant, another Detroit Mumford graduate, and some other people, anticipating the H5N1 pandemic, which fortunately spared us 15 years ago. So it looks at pharmacological interventions and behavioral interventions. Turns out the behavior is a lot more complicated than delivering vaccines and antivirals, which, as we've all learned, turned out to be very complicated in itself. Secondly, say, well, imagine that you've got your team. They should be talking to one another. So I had the opportunity to run a National Academy or an NSF-funded human dimensions of climate change center, and Tom Bearwald, who was our program officer for our center and several other centers, commissioned Denise Carusa and Diana Roten to study the centers, which is very unusual and really laudatory thing for a program manager to do. And Diana came and did these sociometric network analyses of who was talking to whom at what different levels. And you could, each of us could think about our own worlds and think about who is talking to who and how we might design it so that people who have the requisite, make the connections in the predictive model are actually talking to one another. Third thing is since we don't know what people think unless we talk to them, we should be talking to them. If we are trying to serve the public, then we need to be talking to them. And here's a model that I like originally from the Canadian Standards Association guideline 850. It talks about the development of project in the center, with an argument that one needs two-way communication throughout the life of a project. So don't start until you've talked to people and find out what's important to them. Tell them what you're doing and stay in touch, because as projects develop, they inevitably drift from where you start. So here's a model for communication. Something to make this work, there are people who don't naturally get to the table. About 25 years ago, I had the honor to be, the privilege to be part of the National Academy's first Committee on Environmental Justice. And the committee made communication two of its three main research objectives. So the first objective, we need more science to document. People are continuing to do valuable work here to document disparities in pollution, but we need to be talking to people. And then finally, you need commitment. So one could think of the commitment as having two. Part of a commitment is having an abiding philosophy. So Alan Baddeley had this framing, which I read many years ago, and it still appeals to me. He said, it's wrong to think about basic and applied research. We really need these two bridging activities of applied basic science, where you see how well what we believe to be true actually works in reality, and basic applied science, where we pursue fundamental topics arising in applied context, saying that that science not only fulfills its duty to society by working on applied problems, but the science will be better for doing it. One needs incentives, so not all of our academic institutions or our disciplines reward these things, spending time creating personal relations and learning policy environments, collaborating across disciplines, having career paths in applied settings. So we have graduate students who know everything, but are in organizations and are able to take advantage of the expertise, that we value things other than citation counts and funding dollars, and that we see a place for what I think of as asynchronous projects, where let's work the problem now and do the research later, so we help, because often you more or less know what's useful very early in a project, but to fine tune it to a publication standard takes a while. So finally, some examples of places that I think have variants of this. So there was, during World War II, there was the American Soldier Project, which brought together people in the war effort. It had the kind of I guess that, mobilization that you get when there's a shared crisis, which we have now. This is a great summary by Paul Lazarsfeld. I had the opportunity to spend a year at the Medical Research Council Applied Psychology Unit in Cambridge, which Alan Baddeley led at that time, which grew out of the war effort, Cambridge Project, and other unusual place in that it lived in this stately house that one of its leaders, who was independently wealthy, got tired of the government waiting for the money to come around and just bought it. So, glorious place to work. Decision research, where I work with Paul Slovic, Sarah Lichtenstein, Tony Lazarowitz, spent time there, Robin Gregory, who you might know, and we did our work upstairs from a defunct bank on 1201 Oak Street. Paul's closed the office, but he's still active, working on things like, particularly on psychic numbing. I love my Department of Engineering and Public Policy, where most of the research that I reported here has been done. And finally, there are some activist organizations that take advantage of the science. So Yale's Climate Connections, where Tony Lazarowitz is terrific. The Climate Advocacy Lab, which Gabrielle Wong-Prodi and I helped in some of its early stages, is also terrific. And then in Eugene, there's a Northwest Coalition Center for Alternatives to Pesticides, which Mary O'Brien, who I mentioned earlier, helped to start. And I'll stop here. I think leaving people with a picture of a puppy seems like a good place to.
Well, thank you so very much, Professor Fischhoff, for your really fantastic lectures, very stimulating and insightful. And now it's time for questions. The audience, again, is welcome to post questions in the Q&A boxes. There are already a couple questions there in the Q&A box, so maybe you can address those first.
So the first two are from friends, so not softball questions. So the first is from Tom Dietz, who writes, there seems to be a tendency to reduce social science to incentives and nudges. Are there key points to argue that effective programs and policies need to consider more? I think this is really important. I think that I think of there being two worlds. There's a world in which you try to get people to do things that you think would be good for you, good for them, and good for society, which is nudges and incentives. And there's another world that tries to empower people to make autonomous choices. I try to work exclusively in the second world, and to have a firewall between the two, because if you're trying to communicate and people think you're trying to spin things, then you'll immediately lose all credibility. So I recognize we need both, but they need to be kept separate. But I think it is the case that the people who are desperate enough to bring in this, people in power who are desperate enough to bring in the social sciences, typically want us to deliver the public in some ways that it's actually hard to get resources and attention for just giving information to people and trusting them to make good use of it. I would say that in some level, the field that I'm associated with, behavioral decision research, has contributed to this problem by often having a very negative view of the public that reinforces the view that the public needs to be nudged and incentivized, which is sometimes true, but I would say only after you've respected people's right to make autonomous choices. And then Maria Lipinski-Lefebvre says, oh, good, okay. The distinction you highlight for Alan Baddeley is so important. How do we diffuse that thinking, or where do we see it happening these days? So Alan's distinction was needing this combination of these two bridging activities of applied basic research being the reality test of our science, to see if we even have predictions, if we know what to do, if we know how to collaborate with people, and basic applied research to see to see the applications as an engine of science, not as a distraction from it, and as an engine that is as intellectually challenging as any basic science, but requires people to spend time with the people who have the problems, earn their trust, give them the feeling that you will be there if your great idea doesn't work. Many of our institutions don't have that. I mean, the places that I pointed to, like the applied psychology unit, which now has a different name, had government funding from the Medical Research Council, and at the end of the year, you were required to show that you had published in top journals and had made yourself useful. So it was something like having two 75% jobs, but it recognized that you needed to do both, and it, like the Department of Engineering and Public Policy, had top scientists, Kenneth Craig, Donald Broadbent, Alan Baddeley, as its intellectual leaders, and as people with the prominence to be able to make the case for that kind of work. The EPP model, Engineering and Public Policy, has the same structure of people having, for most of our faculty, have a joint appointment in an engineering, in a traditional disciplinary department, social sciences, mostly in engineering or computer science, and an appointment in EPP, which is meant, the model is meant to ensure that you are current with your field, that you're a potential change agent in your field because you're still publishing in those journals, and you're not doing applications because you couldn't hack it in the basic research. So EPP has been, and the APU have been stable, sustaining organizations all the years that I and Paul and others were at Decision Research. It was challenged to find funding because NSF and others don't fund this kind of, tend not to fund I guess, they tend not to fund the places with these kinds of incentives in a way that will make them sustainable. I would think that a great university like like Michigan State with a land grant tradition is the sort of people that can do it, and from what I know about some of your work, has done this for a long time. Oh, Heather Douglas, another friend. What kind of changes in funding structure for science do we need to do community engaged, theoretically informed, and interdisciplinary work? So I pick up where I was saying it's my take on the National Science Foundation, which some of you will have familiar with. So, or for those who are not familiar, NSF, when you apply for a grant, you need to summarize what you're going to do in terms of intellectual contribution, which is to the basic disciplinary science, and your impact, which could be training graduate students, could be empowering local communities, and so on. But the money really all goes to the science. There's typically very little money available for the broader impacts, and it's typically difficult, in my experience, maybe others, to get resources, to slow down the science engine in order to do what some people call, Doug Medina and his colleague call slow scholarship, to slow down and let your research agenda be co-developed with the communities that you're trying to serve. So I think the funders could figure out a way, to move the disciplines that do the evaluation in this direction. So next question. Thank you. I'm curious. Next. Somebody I might know, but is choosing to remain anonymous. I'm curious about how is the ethical dilemma communicating science to the audience and nudging them toward the decision resolved or taken into account. So, those of us who are on the communication empowerment side try to be as clean as we can. I think people on the incentive nudging side, if you read Dick and Cass's book, Nudge, there's some very thoughtful guidance about what it would take to achieve community acceptance and engagement in nudges. And somebody would have to judge independently to what extent that guidance is being followed, or there are the resources for following it, or you could publish a study that didn't treat the world as an experiment that tests a theory. I think it's actually really hard to bring off, and I'm a little happier that I'm in the at least on that respect, that I'm in the what we would like to think of as the empowerment side. And from Noah Chango, what could be an appropriate study framework for analyzing community behavior towards potential forest ecosystem regime shift? So, well, I've given the generic framework of figuring out what are all of the social, ecological, climate factors that are relevant there. From my my intermittent engagement with the climate community over the years, I feel that often the ecosystem, people who study ecosystem have had some difficulty getting in, and just as the people in behavioral science had. So I say, scope out what's the expertise you need, come up with a way to get the people collaborating, work with your community organization, with your stakeholders from the very beginning and to the end, and then test it, and then pull in somebody who knows the all of this behavioral science decision science that can help with the execution. Next one, social scientists tend to distinguish experts' opinions from public opinion, citizen science. Some scientists argue for giving more scientific information and resources to the public, while other scientists believe a citizen-led approach to decision-making, or problem-solving, which is appropriate. So I think that one needs, it's a very complicated question, obviously, but I think one needs a kind of joint collaboration that that recognizes, gives people the right and the empowering information to be in at the beginning, I'm confident you can explain just about anything to people if you do the science, the science right. That if you don't proactively communicate the science or the project, somebody is going to fill that void. And sometimes I think there's way too much attention to misinformation and disinformation, and not enough attention to information, so that you don't leave a vacuum that makes it easier for people to do mischief. And then Paul Rogers, communicating with people of very different views of climate change or even non-believers is difficult. We're often encouraged to start by finding middle ground or common interest, but how do we ourselves effectively find those common ground talking points when some folks seems to be coming from a very different understanding of human impacts on the world? So again, a very complicated problem. A question that I would say, maybe just to build on my previous point, that being proactive in areas where things have not become polarized is a good investment. So Maya and I have been sharing with me some of the pushback from solar in northwest and rural Ohio, and those seem like needless conflicts. That had the proactive, respectful, empowering communication been done sooner rather than later, there would have been less opportunity for people who were, not interested in solar, not interested in the farmers, but were interested in the politics. It would have been harder for them to get in. And
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for your wonderful lectures again. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. And so also thanks to the audience for participating in this lecture so actively. And so goodbye, everyone. And have enjoyed the rest of the day or night, depending where you are. So thank you so much. Yeah.
thank you again for having me and for the great questions.
Yeah.